Welcome to the Pro Bono Happy Hour. I'm Eve Runyon, President and CEO of Pro Bono Institute, here with part 2 of our special edition of the podcast focused on the DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, and how pro bono lawyers can help recipients since the program was rescinded earlier this year. We recently convened a panel of experts for a thought-provoking discussion about the history of the DACA program, how the rescission is impacting DACA recipients, and how pro bono lawyers can help going forward. Brad Phillips of Munger, Told, and Olson moderates the discussion with Jesse Gabriel of Gibson, Dunn Crutcher, Judy London of Public Counsel, and Christina Yang of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Los Angeles. We hope you enjoy part 2 of the conversation, and we encourage you to revisit our earlier podcasts on the DACA program, which you can find on Apple Podcast and YouTube.
We wanted to turn to sort of opportunities that may exist, have existed, and may exist going forward for pro bono engagement by lawyers on DACA-related issues. And I'll kick it off. I mentioned the case, the amicus brief that we did in the case challenging President Obama's expansion of DACA that was brought by various states. And we did that amicus brief on behalf of Californians. We also did a separate amicus brief actually in the Fifth Circuit as opposed to the Supreme Court, where we filed a brief on behalf of a vast number, over 100 immigration law scholars around the country, countering the arguments that have been made by those states that the Obama administration didn't have the authority to enact DACA and that it had failed to comply with the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act in doing so. And one of the main arguments that we made there, in addition to talking about the history of deferred action that Judy mentioned a little while ago, is that we focused on the fact that contrary to popular belief, and apparently the belief of some of the lawyers, DACA does not actually sort of create a group of people who automatically get deferred action without regard to their individual circumstances, which was a key issue with respect to the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act. But in fact, as I think Christina mentioned, there are it really requires case-by-case determination because there are provisions under DACA that allow someone who might otherwise qualify to be excluded based on things like historical abuse of their visa or the fact that they're a danger to national security or public safety or, quote, other factors that an immigration official might think disqualify them from receiving DACA benefits. And that was a crucial issue, really, on the Administrative Procedure Act claim, which unfortunately never really got resolved finally by the Supreme Court. But that's history, so I think I probably ought to let Jesse, who's more involved with the current litigation, talk about what's going on now with respect to this administration's effort to rescind DACA.
Thanks, Brad. So I have had the privilege of, as I mentioned at the beginning, of being involved in 2 different cases related to DACA, and I guess I'll just take them chronologically and provide a little bit of background on them. So the first was for an individual by the name of Daniel Ramirez Medina. This is somebody who was twice granted DACA, and he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time as far as we can tell. ICE came to execute an arrest warrant for another individual. He happened to be there, and he was detained, and we found out about this actually because of Public Counsel, and I'd be remiss not to mention the incredible work that Judy and her team at Public Counsel have done and how privileged we've been to work with them. So Public Counsel became aware of this situation, and we decided to join with them. After Mr. Ramirez was, after the other individual was arrested, he was questioned by ICE agents, informed them that he had a work permit under DACA. He was nonetheless taken into custody. He was taken down to an ICE processing facility where they entered his information into a computer. They confirmed that he had passed multiple DHS background checks, that he did in fact have DACA. They saw his DACA work authorization card, and despite all of this, decided that they were going to continue to detain him. He ended up being detained for more than 6 weeks. During that time, the government also initiated removal proceedings against him. And we, along with some co-counsel, which included some professors, Larry Tribe from Harvard, Erwin Chemerinsky, who's now the dean at Berkeley, Leah Littman from UC Irvine, and also an attorney, Luis Cortez Romero, who is himself a DACA recipient and an incredible individual. We fought the government every step of the way. The government insisted, really without any evidence, that Mr. Ramirez was a gang member. They doubled down on this claim. They sort of slandered his reputation in the media. This case gathered enormous attention in the national and international media, because it really was the first case of a DACA recipient being detained notwithstanding their DACA status. We were finally able to get Mr. Ramirez out on bail, and the shocking thing here was that in the proceedings in immigration court, the government basically admitted that they had no evidence that he was a threat to public safety or national security. So after engaging in this, putting out press releases and issuing statements from the Secretary of Homeland Security calling this individual a gang member, they basically conceded when they were in court that they had no evidence to support that. And notwithstanding that admission, the government has continued to seek Mr. Ramirez's removal and has, really treated him in an extraordinarily unfair fashion, refused to admit that, as we think that this was really just a mistake with some officers who were maybe a bit overzealous or, who knows what was going on there. But the government actually, when we filed a lawsuit in federal court, and the government has really advanced some very extreme arguments. They said that the court didn't have jurisdiction to consider this, and also that in making those arguments that the government really can do whatever it wants. I mean, they really have made some arguments that I think should be very concerning to anyone who is thinking about the DACA program, which is that DACA doesn't really mean anything. And they've said that DACA can be revoked for any reason or no reason at all, without notice, without process. It doesn't matter if the revocation of DACA is based on a factual mistake or an error or the whim of an immigration official. And it doesn't matter if the government complies with its own internal procedures or not, that they can revoke DACA. And so the government, moved to dismiss our complaint, which brought claims under the Administrative Procedure Act. We're seeking to have Mr. Ramirez's DACA restored, and we're seeking a declaratory judgment that there are protected liberty and property interests under the Due Process Clause, and so DACA can't be revoked without notice or process. And we just last week received the good news that the court agreed with us that it had jurisdiction. It rejected the government's arguments and their motion to dismiss. So that case is going to proceed forward. But I think the takeaways for me on that case are, in this environment, the government is just unwilling to admit when it makes a mistake, and the extent to which it's willing to go to pursue removal proceedings against folks, even if they have DACA, and just really the extreme positions they've taken about what DACA means and really what it doesn't mean. Despite having advertised this program and vigorously promoted it and encouraging people to apply for it, they're now taking the position in court that DACA doesn't really mean anything, and they can put you in removal proceedings really at their discretion and on a whim and without any good reason. So that was something that was very concerning to us. I think the other thing to me that was really noticeable and noteworthy about this litigation is just the involvement of our co-counsel, Luis Cortez Romero. As I mentioned, he himself is a DACA recipient, and getting to know Luis and getting to work with him has been just an extraordinary opportunity. I mean, not only is he a really great lawyer and a really sharp guy, but it really just brought into focus for me the types of folks that are, have been able to enjoy the benefits of DACA. And this is a young man who was brought here by his parents, who grew up in this country, who is, always wanted to give back. After graduating from college, he went to work as a teacher and learned a little bit about the law and decided that he could help people more as a lawyer. His story of putting himself through law school is just one that would bring a lot of folks to tears. And, this is somebody who, during his 1L year, waited for all of his classmates to finish studying And then after everyone went to bed, he borrowed their books, and that was how he put himself through law school, studying late into the night with borrowed books. So just an extraordinary guy with an incredible attitude, and is now a practicing immigration attorney in Washington State. And to me, the extraordinary thing, as well as just his bravery, when we went up there to the hearing in immigration court where we were finally able to get Daniel released on bail, it dawned on me for the first time that the immigration court in Tacoma is inside an ICE detention center. And so this is a young man with DACA status who understands that the government is making an argument that DACA doesn't mean anything and that they can pick people up with DACA and place them into removal proceedings, who day in and day out goes through security and walks into an ICE detention facility, not knowing what could happen when he's in there. And so to me, it was just this incredible realization of how extraordinary these young people are, how brave they are, how positive they are, and how much they've been able to overcome, and how much they're giving back to our society. So that to me was a big takeaway from the Ramirez case. When the government announced that it was terminating the DACA program, we again with public counsel decided that we wanted to challenge this rescission. We identified 6 individual DACA recipients who were willing to come forward and put their names on a complaint, and notwithstanding everything that would be associated with that and being out there publicly challenging the administration, were willing to do that. And so we filed on behalf of 6 individual DACA recipients. We had 2 folks who are teachers in Los Angeles, one in a charter school and one in LAUSD. We have 2 folks who are, one's a practicing attorney and the other is a law student, and then we have a medical student and a young woman who's getting her PhD who wants to become a therapist. And so these are all folks who are giving back, who have really ordered their lives around the DACA program. They've made these long-term decisions to buy homes and to enroll in medical school and take out student loans and do all of these things that they were encouraged to do in reliance on the program. And now the rug has just been pulled out from under them. And so our litigation advances a number of statutory, constitutional, and equitable claims. Again, constitutional claims under the Due Process Clause involving the government's termination of the program, and also some arguments, primarily under the Administrative Procedure Act, about the government's revocation of DACA and how it failed to comply with the Administrative Procedure Act. And what's been noticeable in this litigation, which has been moving at a really fast and furious pace, is that the government really maintains that its justification for the rescission of DACA is 100% based on this purported litigation risk. So, after the government decided to rescind DAPA, they received a letter from a number of states' attorneys general who had challenged the expansion of DACA, who said that they were going to amend their complaint in Texas to challenge the DACA program itself. And I think what's notable about this is that there were approximately 2/3 of the state attorneys general who challenged the DAPA program and the expansion of DACA did not put their name on this letter to the government saying that they were going to challenge DACA. And so it was really a much smaller groups of states that were willing to do this. And the government, just decided that it was going to roll over. And, at least that's the story that they're telling people publicly. But in the limited amount of time that we've been able to be involved in this case, and the discovery we've gotten suggests that is very far from the story. The individual who wrote the rescission memo testified under oath in his deposition that litigation risk would be the silliest and stupidest way to or reason to make any kind of decision. And so it's really, I think most people understand and suspect. And if you look at the Attorney General's comments when he announced the rescission of DACA, in which he, advanced a number of various policy justifications, that there's a lot more going on here than this purported litigation risk. So we, in our filings before the court have alleged that a lot of this is just pretextual. And so we are now at a stage in the litigation where the government has filed a motion to dismiss. We've concurrently filed a motion for preliminary relief, asking the court to preserve the status quo and leave DACA in place until until our lawsuits resolved. We're in the middle of briefing those issues, and And I should mention that our litigation in the Northern District of California, we are, it's 5 separate lawsuits. So it's the lawsuit that we've brought. There's a lawsuit from the state of California and several other states. There's a lawsuit on behalf of the University of California, another lawsuit that was brought by the city of San Jose, and then a lawsuit brought by the county of Santa Clara and a labor union. And so we've all been working together. Our cases haven't formally been consolidated, but we're working together to brief these issues and to explain to the court why the rescission of the DACA program is both illegal and unconstitutional.
Great, thanks, Jesse. Am I right that at least some of the arguments that the government is making in defense of the rescission of DACA are, in fact, inconsistent with the arguments that were made by those who challenged the expansion of DACA?
Yeah, I mean, the government has really tied itself in knots here. They'll for various purposes say that this is broad and programmatic, or actually this is just all about particular individuals. They haven't really explained why they made this sudden decision to rescind DACA. If it was really about litigation risk, as you may recall, at the beginning of the Trump administration, only a few months ago, they made a decision to there was an executive order to eliminate all of the a whole range of immigration programs, but they specifically preserved DACA. They specifically carved it out, and now only a few months later have decided all of a sudden that it's that DACA is illegal, or at least there's a litigation risk that a court would strike it down. They haven't really discussed the fact that the Office of Legal Counsel during the Obama administration issued an opinion finding that DACA was an appropriate exercise of prosecutorial discretion, consistent with this long history of prosecutorial discretion that Judy described, and well within the executive branch's authority. So the government has made a lot of arguments that I think have left people scratching their head, and I hope it's going to be that's a lot of what we're trying to illustrate for the court is just the inconsistencies in a lot of their arguments and the positions they've taken, and really their rationale doesn't hold up, and it doesn't when you actually start to examine this program and the tremendous benefits that it provides to the country, to our military, to our citizens, to the government, the findings that the government has made, the representations that it's made to people about the program, that this sudden switch just doesn't make much sense.
Thanks, Jesse. Judy or Christina, does one of you want to talk a little bit maybe about what's being done in terms of pro bono work on behalf of individual DACA recipients or applicants?
Sure. So there was a huge push by the legal community to help as many people as possible renew their DACA status before the October 5th deadline. And in the President's rescission order, there was a time frame set out, which was ludicrous on its face, to give this hundreds of thousands of people this 30-day window to access the legal assistance needed to complete a renewal application. So one barrier is legal assistance by this October 5th, but another barrier was the $495 filing fee. And really the legal community pulled together, and as well as the philanthropic community, and did an extraordinary push to get as many people through that window renewed as possible. But, we don't think this is lawful, but that rescission order essentially has already terminated DACA benefits for anyone who had to renew prior to September 5th. So there's already a segment of the DACA population with expired DACA work permits. Those folks who had a work permit that expired before this date of September 5th are out. So that's many thousands of people right now have lost the protection. Going forward, a lot is up in the air. No pressure on our wonderful litigation team, but folks are waiting to see whether this rescission order, survives the court challenges. But in terms of individual work, we're going to see more and more need for pro bonos. We're particularly concerned with the thousands of DACA recipients who have final removal orders. When immigration detains and seeks to deport someone with a final removal order, here in California, that individual can be tossed into Mexico within 2 or 3 hours. It's that quick, because once you have a removal order, you essentially have had your process, and without a lawyer acting very quickly, you're not going to be able to challenge that order and stop the train from moving and putting you quickly out of the country.
And not to interrupt, but are a lot of those removal orders that were entered in absentia without the presence of the DACA recipient?
A very significant percentage were entered in absentia, and if you think about the DACA population, you had to be under 31 in 2012 to be eligible for DACA. So most DACA recipients who have removal orders, and it's maybe as high as 10 or 15% of the DACA population, had those removal orders entered in absentia when they were children. And what that means is that they're in most circumstances, there is a winning legal argument that those orders are invalid and should be rescinded. And really what's standing in front of a DACA recipient's ability to lift that removal order is access to counsel. And I should just, want to make a point that is important to keep in mind. It's been super gratifying to see that the term DACA is now probably in the Webster's Dictionary, that now people on the street have heard of this term DACA. And there are very good reasons for really resourcing the fight to keep DACA. But DACA recipients have parents and they have siblings, and there's a whole undocumented population now being targeted for enforcement in much the way that Daniel Ramirez was, through, frankly, a very severe breakdown of the rule of law. And only 14% of immigrant detainees ever access counsel. People are 5 times more likely to win their case if they have counsel. So Daniel Ramirez not only shows us how willing the government was to violate its own policies and the Constitution, but also what happens when you bring in a good legal team. So I think there is an opportunity for people to get involved, for pro bono lawyers to take on the defense of DACA recipients with final orders and anyone who is an immigrant who has a final order, because that is easy picking for ICE. In terms of detention and deportation, they do not need the cooperation of local and state actors to enforce against someone with a final order. So that really, I think, is the priority in terms of how advocates see the problem, is to train pro bonos and figure out ways to connect them to individuals. Again, in terms of DACA recipients with final orders, some of them have already lost their DACA. Obviously, the majority of them will lose their protection on March 5th unless we have a favorable court decision, which we're hoping for. There are other issues arising out of the rescission order. So right now we're challenging the ability of Homeland Security to establish an immigrant's removability by introducing into evidence the DACA application. This is a very significant issue because with or without DACA, we're increasingly going to see ICE trying to deport people who exercise their right to remain silent by introducing admissions made in the DACA application. So there are a lot of there are a lot of related issues that are going to trickle into the court system and make their way up to the Federal Court of Appeals. And it's going to be very important to have a fair amount of collaboration on these cases and a strategy to get some good law and to move the law forward.
Yeah, absolutely, Judy. This is Christina. We, within the last year, have really expanded, unfortunately, the removal defense and deportation defense area of our work. And we currently only have one staff attorney who focuses solely on deportation defense, and she spends a lot of her time out in various detention facilities, such as the one in Adelanto, which is north of San Bernardino, north of Victorville. And about 75% of the clients she sees are Asian American or Pacific Islander, mostly Southeast Asian in background. And I think, as Judy mentioned, we're certainly seeing an increased need for pro bono assistance in that area, and we're still trying to, I think, figure out how to best use our existing pro bono partners in this area. We haven't historically had as much pro bono engagement in terms of deportation defense specifically. So we're still exploring ways to get folks trained appropriately, help our sole staff attorney build some capacity so that she can bring on more pro bono attorneys to assist her in working with individual clients. We did recently get some additional funding to hire a senior staff attorney in this area of work, and so our hope is in the first half of 2018 that we'll be able to really expand the number of cases that we place with pro bonos, and also just generally get folks acclimated to the idea of working on one of these cases, which can take longer than your sort of standard T visa or U visa case that I think many firms are used to doing with us. It's certainly a different ball of wax and can take some different twists and turns, and so we're definitely looking to shore up our partnerships in that area.
Great. Thanks, Christina. One question I guess I had was, have people seen already evidence that a lot of this population is, if I can use the expression, going back in the shadows, and maybe like kids not showing up at school, people not seeking out health care, and so on, as much as they did before this?
Sadly, it was easy to identify this trend at the clinics we had to meet the October 5th renewal deadline, as well as just our own colleagues and friends. So we have a colleague here who's one of our, most beloved employees who already dropped out of college but wanting to maximize his income before his work permit goes away. Mm-hmm. And at the DACA clinic, we saw many, many young people who had until recently been in college and then faced with the real prospect that within months or a year their work permits would expire without the ability to continue with a work permit, had pulled out of school to work as much as they can and try to put money away. It's getting more and more difficult to get people to participate in litigation, to do media work, and again, what has been so effective in the immigration advocacy nationwide has been the willingness and the courage of undocumented youth to go to Congress and to essentially come out of the shadows and tell their stories. And I think, in some ways this has been more important than the court battles for this country and for voters to see the faces of their neighbors who are undocumented. But it's getting harder and harder to find people that want to do that and to take those risks. We're also seeing people afraid of retaliation against their family members. So we're even seeing people afraid to file for asylum or some other remedy, for instance, a U visa, because they're fearful that ICE will go after their undocumented relative. So the response, and it has definitely been rapid and severe, and that's another area where advocates are trying to get out into communities and offer Know Your Rights presentations. But again, I think the people living with the fear of deportation every day know best what they need is a lawyer. It's really a time where people understand that without a lawyer, and really with the sort of very serious and egregious violations that we're seeing from our government, suddenly having a lawyer is very important, and the immigrant community understands that.
That's actually the great segue to the next topic we wanted to talk about, which is what's going on in terms of legislation and other policy advocacy around this problem. Maybe, Christina, can you give us an overview of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So within the last several months, there's, of course, because of all the conversation around DACA, there's also been pressure exerted on Congress to take some action to protect what I think most folks know as the dreamer population. And so there are currently a number of different bills sort of percolating, and they all sort of take a different tack, I think, in terms of providing relief to the Dreamer population. And so there's lots of different details here, so I'll do my best to provide a quick overview. But the most bipartisan bill in terms of the support that it has is still known as the DREAM Act, and that was introduced back in July of this year by folks both on the Republican and the Democrat side. And this provides a three-step path to citizenship through having undocumented youth obtain first an initial conditional permanent resident status that could be effective for up to 8 years, and there are various criteria as far as who would be eligible to actually obtain that initial what's known as a CPR status. And after maintaining the CPR status, individuals would then become eligible for a lawful permanent resident status and a green card. And once the green card is received, then they're become eligible to take the pathway to citizenship, which is about 5 years later. And there's also a second act known as the RAC Act. It's the Recognizing America's Children Act. And this is co-sponsored mostly by Republicans as well as one Democrat. And it's similar in structure to the DREAM Act, but more limited in the sense that there are some fairly strict education requirements set around obtaining CPR status and the green card. And it would, folks have analyzed the bill, believe it ultimately would cover fewer folks than the proposed DREAM Act, and it does set a 10-year path to citizenship. The Migration Policy Institute estimates that while about 3.3 million people would initially be eligible under this current version of the DREAM Act, there would only be about 2.5 million that would be eligible under the RAC Act. There's also the Succeed Act, which is being put forth by a few different Republicans in the Senate. And this is somewhat similar to the RAC Act, but it has the most restrictive of the eligibility requirements. Includes very narrow age limits, severe exclusions for relatively minor crimes, and some very stringent education and work requirements. And some folks believe it also undermines some due process as well. And so I think generally immigration rights advocates believe that the Succeed Act is probably the least desirable. And there's also finally the American Hope Act, known as the Hope Act, which has been introduced by a Democrat and is supported by over 150 Democrats. This covers a fairly large number of folks, including those who arrived more recently. There's also some pro-immigrant legislation here in California that's passed recently, just this fall, that we at Advancing Justice have been very happy to have helped pass. And there's several different bills, but I'll just provide some highlights quickly for listeners. The first is SB 74, which is the California Values Act, and this specifically ensures that local and state law enforcement resources aren't being used for federal immigration enforcement. And in other words, this will help ensure that the state's public facilities like schools and libraries and hospitals and courthouses, they remain accessible to members in the community regardless of their immigration status. And Advancing Justice, now that the bill has passed, we're focused on making sure implementation goes smoothly next year. And that involves reaching out to law enforcement and providing some toolkits that outline to them what their responsibilities are and sort of monitoring whether or not they're following what the bill requires as far as not supporting federal immigration enforcement directly. We also have SB 31, the California Religious Freedom Act, which recently passed, and that ties back to a lot of the activity we've seen around a quote-unquote Muslim registry at the federal level. And what this bill does is prohibit state and local agencies from providing federal authorities with personally identifiable information regarding religious affiliation if it's being used to compile a database like the Muslim registry. And we also have AB 699, the Safe Schools for Immigrant Students Act, and this limits collection of information about the immigration status of students in public schools, and therefore we think will really do a lot to ensure access to public education for everybody in the state. And so I think in general, although we're not sure what will happen on the federal level yet with the DREAM Act, it's very encouraging, I think, here in California to see that the state is very supportive of the immigrant community and is going to continue to do its best to fight against what might be some unfriendly federal policies from above. And I think more recently there has also been some scuttlebutt, if you will, that there has been some pressure being exerted by the Democrats around the government's need to pass a spending bill at 2017 year end, using that as leverage to get some protection for DACA recipients passed. And so the hope is, since this spending bill is a must-pass to, keep the government running, as it were, that they will be able to include some sort of protections for DACA recipients in this year-end back and forth. And so that would hopefully take place, but that remains to be seen in December, I think.
What, if anything, do you think that, in particular private lawyers out there can do to help with respect to any of the legislative action?
Well, I think as far as our immigration policy advocates work here, one of our immigration rights advocates, he is a DACA recipient himself. His name is Anthony Nung, and he is Filipino. He's been working in this area for about 5 or 6 years now, and came from the Philippines at age 12. He was shared with me that he, along with a coalition of various API organizations working in this area, part of a roundtable advocating for a Clean Dream Act. They're really hoping that whatever is passed, whether it's one of the bills that I just described or perhaps something completely different, there won't be any provisions built in that would negatively impact the current immigration system or perhaps persecute their parents or other folks that aren't fitting the dreamer narrative, as it were. And I think they're really looking for folks to help them support that advocacy and lobbying to keep this idea of a Clean Dream Act visible as Congress continues to move forward, hopefully in the right direction.
This is Judy, and just to add some ideas to that, we really need to keep the advocacy going and not lose steam. And in terms of private lawyers who want just like a quick thing to do, phone calls matter. And I think one of the easiest ways to know who to direct calls to is to go to the website of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, known as AILA. So it's AILA.org. And they have a great advocacy page that says Take Action Now, and it's really simple, and within 3 minutes you can identify exactly who you should call and urge for the passage of a Clean Dream Act. And in addition to that, public statements by corporate clients have become increasingly important, and a lot of major businesses put out statements when President Trump rescinded DACA. And those kinds of statements picked up a lot of media, and I think lawyers are often in a position to engage their clients about these issues. There are also a lot of clients that you'll find have a large number of DACA youth employed, and they're eager to find ways to get involved in the advocacy just as a business matter to make sure that they can keep their employees.
Is there, and maybe Judy, I don't know whether you know here, but is there other potential litigation coming down the road? You talked about representing individual clients, but I wondered whether there are sort of specific issues that you see getting litigated in the near term beyond what we've already talked about, sort of generally about the rescission itself.
I mentioned the issue of how the information provided by a DACA recipient can be used, and I think that is going to arise in a number of different ways in both the impact cases as well as individual removal proceedings.
Right. Basically a situation where the person's been, I don't want to use the word too derogatorily, but enticed into providing the government with all this information about themselves in order to get deferred action and then have that information used against them to deport them.
Right.
And what about, Christina, maybe you have some thoughts about what sort of situation does this pose for people's jobs and so on?
Thanks for asking that question, Brad. Certainly the question of employment has been definitely foremost in folks' minds when thinking about DACA being terminated, because the work authorization benefit is such a huge part of what's been important to community members who've been able to take advantage of the DACA program. And reaching back as far as about a year ago after President Trump was elected, folks in the nonprofit sector who have worked on immigrant rights issues and are familiar with DACA-serving populations began thinking about what were some steps we could take to support community members if, in fact, the DACA program was terminated at some point down the line. And unfortunately, as we discussed earlier, we did see that day come to pass just this past September, a couple months ago. And so at the beginning of this year, in January, February, there was sort of an ad hoc working group of various nonprofits, including Advancing Justice LA, Public Counsel, NILC, Educators for Fair Consideration, and Democracies at Work Institute, among many others, who began thinking about not only ways that DACA recipients could continue to earn income without the DACA work authorization, but also looking at some employer-facing issues. As both Judy and I mentioned earlier, there are various nonprofits that have DACA recipients on staff and have had them on staff for the last several years. So just thinking about how employers could potentially continue to support DACA beneficiaries even if they didn't have work authorization. And also looking at things like independent contractor positions, just sort of creative solutions to the work authorization piece of DACA going away in the near future. And the idea of setting up DACA recipient LLCs and worker co-ops came to mind to the group earlier this year because they've been used for years already, even reaching back to before the DACA program came into being, and have had immigrant worker members. There are various grocery worker co-ops, for example, or janitorial worker co-ops that have been in place for many, many years now. And so the thought was if there was a way to use that model and deploy it for DACA recipients who would have to be folks with more of an entrepreneurial mindset, who'd be open to generating income through a small business, essentially. And this is workable because members of an LLC co-op could earn income through that entity as an owner member and not actually be considered a quote-unquote employee, because otherwise, as an employee, of course, that individual would be subject to needing work authorization. And so this project certainly is still nascent in that there's some different challenges that we're facing. It's sort of uncharted territory, though co-ops have been, with immigrant members, have been around for a long time. It's the first time that everyone's putting on their thinking caps and thinking about DACA recipients specifically as members. And certainly I think in the current climate we're seeing where the federal government is employing some much harsher immigration enforcement tactics than we've seen in the past. We're also concerned about any potential immigration-related enforcement consequences for potential customers and clients of any such LLC co-op that has DACA recipient members. We've also been thinking about finding pro bono support for setting up these entities. And one thing that's been challenging is that the worker co-op is a sort of different creature, if you will, than the typical large firm who does corporate transactional work has experience with. And so most large firms, the attorneys don't have experience in the co-op space, and certainly not with this particular population. And so expertise has been something that we're looking at, given that this is a pretty specialized niche. And so I certainly encourage, if there's anyone listening to this podcast who does in fact have experience forming co-ops involving immigrant workers, to please reach out to us and let us know. We've been working on that particular piece of the puzzle recently as well. We're hoping down the line that we can set up LLC co-ops for groups of DACA recipients, potentially, also involving potentially other immigrants who aren't DACA recipients necessarily. And there's, in fact, a planned potential pilot that Democracies at Work Institute is potentially getting off the ground in the Long Beach area. And so we're looking for community members who are DACA recipients who might be a good fit for this pilot, just to see if it'll work and what are some of the issues that we still have to work through. And we're, of course, also working on identifying potential customers and clients for that co-op pilot as well. So it's certainly a very robust area that the working group is exploring, and we're hoping that it'll end up being a viable option for at least some of the community members that we have served through DACA.
Thanks. I just wanted to comment. One of the big points that we made in the brief that we filed on behalf of California business entities and other groups in the case Texas versus U.S. that challenged President Obama's expansion of DACA. One of the big points we made there was to rebut the myth that employment of undocumented immigrants hurts other workers in the United States and hurts the economy. And really the view is, I think, that it's exactly the opposite is the case, that undocumented immigrants typically take work that other native workers don't want to take, and that undocumented workers do because they really aren't able to find anything else, and that they, increase economic output as a result, and in fact increase the real wages of the native workers. And so I think it's important to rebut that, I think, fairly commonly held myth about this group of people really hurting other workers or hurting the economy. Maybe we could turn, if we could, to sort of the educational sector. And I don't know, Jesse, if you have thoughts. I know the University of California is very concerned about the effect of rescinding DACA on it, and maybe you have some specific thoughts about that and what may happen going forward there.
Yeah, I can't speak for the university because it's not my client, but I have been able to read some of their pleadings and their declarations and other things, and I think that these folks have made a tremendous contribution to the University of California. The CSU system and the other educational groups and institutions have submitted declarations and amicus briefs in support of our litigation challenging the rescission. We had a declaration from one of the board members in LAUSD, and I think at every level of the educational system, these folks are making an enormous contribution. They're bringing in really important perspectives into the classroom and into laboratories and into discussions, and really contributing in the same way that they're doing throughout our society. And the flip side of that is also that the UC system and it's in the same way that businesses has made a tremendous investment in a lot of these folks. They've decided to admit them to their medical schools and to their law schools, and I think we all know how precious that space is and how hard it is to get into those institutions, and the extraordinary investment that these academic institutions are making in these young people. And so they made these investments in reliance on the government's promises and representations about DACA, and understanding that getting a medical degree or some of these other degrees is more than a 2-year endeavor. So I think that there is really just been an incredible outpouring of support and concern from the education community, from academia, and also from the business community, frankly. Just an extraordinary number of businesses and business organizations and some of the most innovative companies in California and in the world, frankly, have come out really strongly in support of DACA. And there was actually a letter that was sent to President Trump before the rescission was announced by some of the leading business executives in the United States, and they made the argument that this is actually part of America's competitive advantage, that these people bring special skills and cultural understandings and language and there all these incredible attributes and knowledge that they have, and that these are really important both in the classroom and in the laboratory and in the business world and for these innovative companies. So, again, I think it really underscores a lot of what you were saying, Brad, about the broader benefits of this program, and this argument that somehow DACA hurts people or that immigration hurts people. I think the data does not bear that out.
I think in many ways the good news is that from where I sit, to a large extent we've won the war in terms of public opinion. I think if there was a vote today among voters nationally, there would be overwhelming support for a path to citizenship for all DACA recipients. The problem is that what's happening in terms of federal policy does not appear to be rational and have any connection to what the public sentiment is. And so to encourage people to remain engaged, because this has been a long struggle, it may be longer depending on what happens in the courts. The issue with higher education, it's not so much that you can't go to school if you lose DACA. You can. Certainly in California, you will continue to have that opportunity and to be recognized as a resident for purposes of benefiting from lower tuition costs for residency. The problem is people will lose decent-paying jobs, and they will not be able to go to school because they won't have the money that's required to live and to pay the tuition that's required. So I do think there's going to be a real necessity for those that really want to engage with this cause, but maybe do not have the time to engage in huge litigation. This opportunity to engage, and whether that's making phone calls or working to create a fund to benefit undocumented students that students could draw on in the event that we do not see a solution in the near future. There are plenty of ways that people can be involved aside from filing a lawsuit, although we encourage the filing of lawsuits too. But the engagement is really important right now.
This is Jesse. I just want to tag on one thing to what Judy said, which is all right, which is the most recent public opinion polling I've seen shows that an overwhelming majority of Americans support a path to citizenship for DACA recipients, and that includes a majority of Republican voters. So I think this is an issue where there has been a breakdown in the political process, and it really, frankly, it's crazy that the Congress hasn't dealt with this issue and dealt with it in the right way.
Well, that's great. Any other thoughts before we conclude about either concerns going forward or additional ways in which people might get involved in these issues?
Well, this is just more of an observation. We had DACA clinics running on weekends before this final deadline for renewal, and it's really the first time I've seen large numbers of DACA youth so moved by basically these volunteer efforts of private lawyers who were coming down to public counsel. Some had called ahead and asked how they could help. Some just showed up. But it was quite astonishing to see the emotional impact it had. These young people really weren't used to seeing people outside their communities come down and say, "We've got your back. We really want to be here for you." So this is really more, anything anyone does on behalf of immigrant kids, and particularly the DACA population right now, it really translates into more than just an application being filed. It really helps people in the crossfire right now feel courageous about moving forward. So on behalf of public counsel, we're extraordinarily grateful for the efforts of the legal community and just urge people to keep it up.
That's a great point, Judy. And I think as far as from where Advancing Justice LA sits, we are definitely very focused on supporting and getting members of the API community out who may have been worried about coming out of the shadows before. It's been difficult historically for us to reach the API community on this issue. I think, generally the issues of undocumented immigrants are seen more as something that belongs to the Latino community, even though research and statistics show that there are quite a number of API immigrants that are actually undocumented. And we think it's as many as 1 in 7 in the U.S. who's actually undocumented now. And so there's really quite a large population that has benefited from DACA. And thanks to advocates like my colleague Anthony Nung, we've been really working on pushing that message out. And I totally agree with Judy that it's been really heartwarming to see the support from the legal community and from others in the APA professional community since the termination of the program was announced. We've gotten a lot of messages of support from folks in the community who would like to do whatever they can to help the government move in the right direction. And so a huge thanks to those in the private sector who've been supporting us on this.
Well, on that note, I just want to say that I am in the private sector and have been for my entire career, but probably about the most satisfying work I've ever done has been in the immigration area, pro bono, representing the interests of immigrants. And I will say that one could hardly find a group more deserving of your pro bono assistance than people who were brought to the United States when they were children, unlawfully, but through no fault of their own, and have been here and have built families and have jobs and are in our schools with others and contributing to the economy and generally contributing to the welfare of the country, frankly. Hard to find a more deserving group for your pro bono assistance because it is hard for them and to find lawyers, but absolutely crucial, as Judy and Christina were saying earlier, absolutely crucial for them to have a lawyer. The difference between staying and not staying may well turn on whether they have a lawyer or not.
This is Jesse. I just want to underscore and agree 100% with everything you said, Brad. I think that's exactly right. I think for me personally, this has been among the most satisfying work that I've done as a lawyer. I mean, it's just been such a privilege to be part of it, and the clients are so extraordinary and so deserving of representation, and you really do feel like you have an opportunity to make a difference in someone's life and in the life of this very deserving population. And I also just want to give the flip side of what Judy and Christina said, which is just as a lawyer in private practice, it's been so incredible to watch the extraordinary work that firms like Public Counsel and Advancing Justice and others are doing, and just to see in these really, I guess we could call them complicated times, their willingness to step up and protect the rule of law and the Constitution and the basic humanity of these groups. So I have to say, for all the folks out there who are thinking about ways to get involved, getting in touch with groups like Public Counsel is a really good way to make an impact.
I echo that wholeheartedly, and I would also say that to the extent people are worried about their lack of expertise, I can assure you couldn't have more lack of expertise than I did when I first started doing some immigration work. And the people who do this full time, just do a fabulous job of providing the backdrop support that you need to do it and do it right. So I encourage people not to be overly nervous about getting in and diving in and helping people. Thank you all so much for your time and really great thoughts.
Many thanks to Brad, Jesse, Judy, and Christina for making time to share their knowledge and insights into the DACA program. We at PBI look forward to supporting our pro bono partners as they continue to advance access to justice for immigrants. New and archived episodes of the podcast can be found on Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. We would love to hear from you. Send your comments, feedback, and questions to probono@probonoinst.org. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Pro Bono Happy Hour.